located approximately 12 miles west of Chicago and 1 mile east of Bensonville Yard. B-12 was a Milwaukee Road-controlled tower which originally guarded the crossing of the Milwaukee Road, now Canadian Pacific, and Soo Line, now Canadian National. Metra now owns the former Milwaukee Road main line at this location, while ironically, the CN owns the former Soo Line. The interlocking is now automated and controlled by Metra at their Consolidated Dispatching Center in Chicago. The old tower itself now resides in a nearby park in downtown Franklin Park. Several changes have come to B-12 in 2006, including a set of east connections from the Canadian National to the 3 tracks of Metra, and are most often used by their North Central service trains to Antioch. Also currently in construction at the time of this video is a new double-track IHB connection, which will be used by both the CP and CN to gain access to the Indiana Harbor Belt. You will also notice several Iowa, Chicago, and Eastern runs from the Indiana Harbor Belt pulling and shoving off the IHB to gain access to the main line, thus avoiding a run through Bensonville Yard. Plenty of Canadian Pacific and Canadian National trains make appearances, as you will see. We will start 5 miles east of B-12 on the Metra Canadian Pacific Line. At Central Avenue, 3 Metra trains duck under the Central Avenue Bridge. A westbound CP empty sulfur train with Norfolk Southern Power is leaving Galewood Yard heading for Tower B-17 to head towards the C&M sub. Galewood Yard is a staging yard for trains to and from the Belt Railway of Chicago. Between Galewood and B-12, trains of various railroads can be seen, including Metra, Canadian National, Norfolk Southern, Wisconsin Southern, which nocturnally runs to and from the BRC east towards Tower A5 for the C&M sub, and the Iowa, Chicago, and Eastern. CP train 742 passes Galewood Station, headed for the BRC connection at Cragen. A CP loaded coke train sits in Galewood Yard. The lead 8 units will cut off, leaving the Indiana Railroad's SD-60s to handle the loads north towards the Twin Cities. It will be some time when the coke train gets underway. Meanwhile, eastbound Metra 2228 races down number 3 Main toward Chicago. At the Galewood Metra station, CP's eastbound Division Street local heads towards Industries near Tower A5. Back at Galewood Yard, Metra 2215 heads past the 2 Indiana Railroad XSU SD-60s. Moving further down the line, Metra 2242 makes a stop at Mars Metra Station, followed by CP Train 198 and NS-powered G53. CP's Southside job is returning to Bensonville Yard from Mars Candy and a few other local industries on the west side of Chicago. A westbound Metra train heads through Elmwood Park. At Elmwood Park, the shallow-angled road crossing is Grand Avenue. This has been the site of many fatal auto train incidents, which is the reason for all the added lights and signage. As the second Metra train passes, CP train G45, which came off the BRC at Cragen Junction, heads for Bensonville Yard at Elmwood Park. The lead unit is a rebuilt ex-Union Pacific GP40X, now designated a GP38-2 by CP. These units were rebuilt by National Railway Equipment. Next, we set up at the Elmwood Park station to view three trains. The first is CP train G45, met by train 295. Iowa, Chicago, and Eastern Train MBR-CHU, which is a manifest from the Belt Railway of Chicago to Huron, South Dakota, passes the station. We now set up at the heart of B-12. Here, southbound CN train M346 is heading for Forest Park and eventually the Belt Railway of Chicago. Eastbound CP train G41 is next at B12. This is a transfer move of intermodal from CP's Bensonville Yard, which runs via the BRC to reach Norfolk Southern's Landers Intermodal Yard. Landers is located near BRC's Clearing Yard. The train, due to its slow move as a transfer run, is often dubbed as the Comet, and always runs with a caboose due to its several backup moves it must make to enter and exit Landers. A curious crew member joins us as we capture CN train A447 at Belmont Avenue, just north of B12. CN 5659 is waiting for a fresh crew to take the train further into Chicago.
So that's primarily all you do is just train and stuff like that, really?
CP train G41 heads for Landers Yard at B12. We set up at the CN connection to the IHB. This connection will soon be abandoned for a new one. This is a very rickety connection which twists and turns through an industrial complex. Derailments and problems with the track are not uncommon. Westbound Metra 2213 crosses in front of the CN at Tower B-12. CP's Southside job is next to cross the CN. An Indiana Harbor Belt transfer from CP's Bensonville Yard heads for IHB's Norfolk Yard. It is running engine light, with two ex-Illinois Central Paducah rebuilt SD-20s. Back at the IHB connection, CN train 331 includes two unfinished BNSF SD-70 ACEs. two BNSF units are to be finished in the Horicon, Wisconsin shops of the Wisconsin Southern Railroad. From the other end of the CP-IHB connection, weeds are about to overtake the rails. Soon a new connection will be put in place that will allow trains of the CP and CN to share the connection to the IHB with less curvature of that of the current connection. CP Train 616, which is a loaded molten sulfur train, heads out of Bensonville and onto the weed-grown IHB connection at Tower B-12. The train will utilize the harbor to CSX's Bar Yard for CSX destinations. The 8 light engines off the 889 train we saw earlier in the show heads westbound for Bensonville Yard at the east end of the B-12 plant. The CN track geometry train with engineer Bill Beecher at the throttle passes B-12. The train is heading south, testing rails to Forest Park, then return to continue north, shoving toward Antioch, which is on the former Wisconsin Central. northbound, the CN track geometry train returns from Forest Park for points north. At Edgington, on the west end of B-12, Union Pacific Train YPRCP leaves Bensonville for the IHB and UP's Proviso Yard. The former Tower B-12, albeit removed from its original location, can be seen in the distance in a nearby park. We are now set up at the CN-CP Diamond at B-12. The first switch after the Diamond is the current CN connection to the IHB. The two tracks at right are the new IHB connections that are planned to be used soon. CP westbound train 295 crosses the CN at B-12, headed for Tower B-17, and the C&M subdivision towards Milwaukee and points west. CP's G44 transfer comes off the IHB at Edgington, bound for Bensonville Yard. Illinois Central 6002 leads a northbound CN General Freight off the IHB connection and crosses the CP Metra heading towards Schiller Park. IC&E train L596 comes off the IHB at Edgington and makes a reverse move to access the mains to avoid Bensonville Yard and head west towards Davis Junction. Once again, B-12's original tower, now in a trackside park, can be seen to the right of the engines. Now on the main, the IC&E L596 heads west through B-12. The new CP-IHB connection tracks can be seen in the foreground as the ICE train heads past. CP eastbound 646 heads for the BRC down number 2 main at B-12. A CP train heads for the IHB and eventually CSX's Bar Yard, down the IHB connection. Southbound CN train A412 is on the CN IHB connection and crosses Chestnut Street. This train will use the IHB to gain access to Union Pacific's Proviso Yard, located just a short distance from here. Westbound IC&E MBR-CHU now heads west at the east end of the B-12 plant. The double set of crossovers are for access to the CN at B-12. Our next location in the B-12 vicinity is at Franklin Park, just west of B-12. Around the bend comes Indiana Harbor Belt's NA-8 transfer for Bensonville Yard. The NA-8's symbol means N for IHB's Norpal Yard, the A for AM, and 8 for the on-duty time of the job. Next is IC&E's Indiana Harbor Belt to Norfolk Yard to Davis Junction turn, with engineer Adam Ferentz and an excellent-sounding Nathan M5 whistle on top of engine 4207. This train is a nocturnal turn which originates at Davis Junction to the IHB and return. The IHB trip is alternated with a trip to Bensonville on the following night. Due to the track arrangement at B-12, the ICE train needs to make a reverse move to access the mains to avoid having to travel through Bensonville Yard and out the other end. These shots were taken from Metra's Franklin Park Depot platform just west of B-12. For the last segment, we will revisit Edgington at the west side of B-12 interlocking. Edgington is the location of the IHB connection with the east yard leads of CP's Bensonville Yard and is named for the road crossing which bisects the tracks here. CP's G41 Comet job gets underway for Norfolk Southern's Landers Yard, while as the caboose clears, a CP-286 train heads down main track number 2, also towards the BRC. Train MBRCHU heads westbound through B-12 at Edgington.